So that's one specific issue. Um, Joint security at the border. I'm continually dumbfounded why we have two sets of people sitting on the most peaceful border between two countries. I think, if NORAD can figure out how to protect us in the air, I think we could figure out a border service that's going to, from a customs and excise perspective, do that job. So I think that there are some things underway. But again, I'm less concerned. I mean, of course, we're concerned about the Canada-U.S. border, but I think we're missing a much bigger opportunity outside of North America that we need to be able to facilitate. Does that answer your question?
Am I allowed to respond?
Yeah, no, you, please.
I think it's interesting that you talk about, sort of harmonization of visa process and joint criteria, because actually that is part of what's in BTB, but it's not necessarily stated, so we can, it's stated in terms of
I'm
security.
stating that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole perimeter concept, right? Is the idea that we want to be able to share enough information about who is coming to our country, who's applying to come to our country, sort of immigration and visa information sharing is part of this, so that each country can have all the same information with which to make its immigration decisions. And, sort of the next step, conceivable step to that could be some sort of joint visa process. Now, that may be too far down the line. Let's see how we do with this piece first, right? That's what I mean, like the steps that are needed to get to that seemingly easy idea. That's the incremental pieces. I think that, that understanding that piece is what's in here are the steps needed to get to some of those long-term outcomes that everybody has been hoping and looking for. They've been articulated more clearly maybe than they've ever have been in the past. I think what the actual steps needed to get to that point is.
And so Canada, just another example, Canada's moving to an electronic travel authorization system. So that's another area. And again, the benefit of an electronic travel authorization system is effectively, it's not like pre-clearance for my CBSA friends, but it's like pre-clearance. So you're assessing risk before people actually get on the plane and they arrive in country. Again, when you're sharing that level of information and you have that type of passenger information, it makes a visa per se a less necessary vehicle. A visa is a 19th century vehicle that we use to govern travel and to assess risk, mostly for immigration purposes. And both our immigration departments look at visitors as short-term immigrants. So we have to change that. That's a changing perspective. So effectively, you have to go through a similar, not exactly, but a similar process to come to Canada, the United States from some of these countries. Electronic travel authorization, to your point, once you build those bricks, it's easier to make a policy decision. Let's take Brazil as an example. For both the Canada and the United States, to say, should we extend visa waiver status to Brazil, given the relative risk? And once we have something like an ETA or a combined ETA in place, that makes it an easier decision to make than just, worried about whose visa is stronger than the other one.
So back in the neighborhood, North America, so go forth and do good work on that. I truly mean that, and I mean that to our Canadian or government officials in the room. We all get the perimeter, so we don't need to discuss that too much. But again, when the action plan is fully implemented, what we'll be watching for is it as easy, if not easier, for a warranty repair person who's an American, who has a Nexus card, who's been security vetted and to cross Champlain, New York, to go to Montreal to fix a production plant that's been stilled, or a Canadian architect, a U.S. executive, name the list. We are still working under, Chapter 20 of the NAFTA? 21, 24 years old now? Where the category of workers that we are supposed to be facilitating includes things like a computer specialist or a computer programmer. These things are easy. They're not hard. It's not a leap. But that's the environment that our North American manufacturing and the business community are facing. So I get the risk assessment on the perimeter. Of course we do. We all do.
Yeah,
Canada-U.S. border.
Can I
Sorry,
just jump in
David.
on that? I agree with that forcefully. Obviously, we have two different issues, but we have a skills shortage in Canada. Like we don't have an employment problem in Canada. We have, especially in the skills trades or in semi-skilled trades, we have a huge deficit to the point where we're enlisting temporary foreign workers, and we're using all kinds of square pegs to bang into round holes to fulfill our economic lack of people to do that work. And because of it happens in our industry as well, by the way, whether it's, the Starwoods and the Fairmonts, and, they're international companies, but they're cross-border companies, and they need to flow those people back and forth as well. So that I don't mean to diminish that as an issue. And within the greater context of the Canadian economy, I guess we have a different problem than you do here in the U.S. But I'm not sure how many things we can fix at the same time.
All right, but let me pick up on something that kind of undercurrent of several of these comments. What about technology? I mean, everybody likes gadgets at Christmas time and all that, but is there a degree to which we solve some of these problems with technology? And if there is, how do we develop, test, and pay for it so we can implement it border-wide? I mean, to what extent is technology the answer, and to what extent is that maybe just a, pipe dream down the...
Well, I would say that the Australians have a really good electronic travel authorization program. Now that it helps that they have a 6,000-mile moat around them. We our two countries don't. But it's a really good model, one that I think we're basing the Canadian model on. I think you're right. I mean, this is the 21st century, and we're using, passports and visas are 19th and early 20th century vehicles, which aren't warranted anymore. And from our perspective, do all the risk assessment and mitigation before somebody gets on the plane. And you can do that very easily. The facilitation of that is quite easy to do electronically. It's even easier for airport management to move people through based on risk assessment, and then let people flow.
I think, technology is how you implement risk management. It's the way you have to do it. But I would say that it all comes back to information, right? So the biggest challenge you have with the U.S.-Canada border is that you have so little information generally in such a short period of time before that person, that car conveyance, whatever, comes to the border. Now that's changed a lot, particularly on the cargo side. In the last 7-8 years, there's a lot more information available ahead of time. But for the traveler, it's still not the case. And so your ability to make those risk assessment choices at the actual physical land border is much more limited. So you still do need to have technology. That's why they talk about RFID readers and expanding the use of, now, RFID readers will help only to the extent that people actually have RFID cards to use. And with all due respect to my Canadian friends, the passport is not actually the best border crossing document for the land border. Most Canadians already had a passport and don't like the idea of purchasing another card, like an enhanced driver's license from the provinces that have them. But that allows, at least, for 10 to 15 seconds before you pull up the booth, your information to be in the systems to allow it to be vetted so that you can have that expedited process at the land border. And there simply aren't enough people crossing the U.S.-Canada border with those enabled documents as there are at the southern border to make that crossing, help to actually make the streaming, if you will, or the categorization of people that CBP is trying to do at the land border actually function properly. So I agree with you. The process for getting an Nexus card is not nearly as easy or transparent. Forget if you actually have to change something once you've got it, like your residence. So that's something CBP absolutely could work with. But once you have it, the process is actually a little bit, it is faster, for most things. So I think the technology behind the scenes, that's the technology you see at the border. The technology behind the scenes is equally as important. CBP has invested millions and millions of dollars in systems designed to assess risk, to actually sift through all of the information it is gathering about people and conveyances and cargo and figure out what they need to pay attention and look at. And that process is highly technology dependent. because the machines can sift through that amount of information much faster than individuals. Now, the decision at the end of the day is still an officer who looks at all of that as advisory and says, okay, I should pay more attention and ask more questions of this person, or I should examine this cargo more closely. But that's all in support of that risk management principle. So technology is absolutely going to be the answer, and it's expensive. It is. And that's the challenge. That's why I mentioned earlier about, that's going to be the challenge in an era of austere governments. How do you do that?
So I can talk about this for 4 hours. This is so near and dear to my heart, but I'm going to try and get this out in 1 minute. Risk management is not cheap, and risk management, it needs data. And we've had 11 years of advanced cargo data requirements on our most trusted corporate citizens, and it's not cheap. You heard that it's not cheap. I feel like it's he said, she said, but yeah, so it's not cheap for governments. Well, of course it isn't. That's why your import fees and your agency fees on both sides of the border have been doing this. Merchandise processing fee, COBRA fees, the whole thing. It's going up. On the Canada-U.S. trade, North American jobs, our future. So it's expensive for government agencies. But on the other side of that back end, you have companies who have to scramble at the risk of paying a $10,000 per truckload fine to provide their broker and border agencies with far more data about this, far more intrusively into the supply chain, electronically 1 hour before the truck hits the border. And by the way, it's less than an hour from Montreal to the U.S.-Canada border, and a truck driver right now is $90 an hour, idling, idling, idling. The IT, the human resources, the time it takes for this widget for the company to produce and provide to the border 22 different data elements, and I pity agri-food, who have far more data elements to send, is not cheap. It's not free, and it's not cheap, which right now, on the average, has raised the cross-border transaction cost to double digits. And this is a non-tariff environment. That's the tax we're putting on the Canadian-U.S. manufacturing sector. And back to my point, why do we have to send 22 data elements of this widget, which company A is sending 20 times a day, exactly the same thing through the same port of entry? It's not expensive, it's not cheap. So risk assessment, where risk is probable, again on our perimeter, I understand that. We've had 24 years. 30%, over 30% of CBP's global CTPAT FAST membership are Canadian companies. 95% of truck drivers who cross the Canada-U.S. border are FAST approved and vetted. What more do our manufacturers need to do? Anyways, sorry.
Oh, no.
Again, 2 hours, but.
Clearly, I've hit a nerve. The gentleman there has a question.
Hi, Ed Wolking with Detroit Regional Chamber, also Great Lakes Metro Chambers and Coalition and Great Lakes Manufacturing Council. I have heard, I applaud everything you all are saying in technology, especially what Bridget just said. It's absolutely important to hear that message and act on it. I've also heard something from people who operate at the U.S. Canadian borders, particularly New York to Canada and Canada to Michigan, that a lot of this is also just simple blocking and tackling and process management, queuing management, just really simple things to make sure that the right vehicles get in the right lanes at the right time and they don't get all tangled up. And so I would not have us, in the sake of pursuing technology and those things that are expensive, ignore the things that can be inexpensive fixes to this issue as well.
That's right. Technology mirrors the policy. So rather than the conversation about the technology, it's a conversation about the policy.
And some of the technology, you can't have that discussion without having the infrastructure discussion as well. I mean, where we're looking at border modernization, port modernization, especially on the land borders and bridge development and those types of things. So traffic management is, I take. Here in these four walls, I take my kids skiing in Vermont. Okay, it's don't tell anyone, but and those of us who do it know that there are times of days that you're just not gonna, and we game which border crossing we're going to go to based on. But I know it doesn't sound like technology because it's bricks and mortar, but that sort of facilitation management is important as well. It's actually it's true on the ground, but it's even more so in airports. And again, I know I keep going back to the people issue, but facilitation of the lines of people in airports. I'll give you a very, very simple example, a recommendation we made to CBSA. Canada, much later than the United States, got approved destination status with China. So we're actually starting to see huge lift from China now. We're starting to see 26% increase in visits from China. The problem when these tours show up is if they get scattered in the line at CBSA, you need an interpreter who's with the tour to go to each officer and have the same discussion over and over again, instead of an express line where because the tourist company, their visas are coming, we know who they are and where they're coming from. There's a way to establish a fast track process even within the line to deal more efficiently with some of those travelers. So I agree, and I don't think technology is just limited to something like an electronic travel authorization piece.
Other questions? We have, I think, time for one more, given my voluble panel, to keep us on schedule. The man who's no longer wearing yellow.
It's warm in here. Yeah. Since no one else has a question, I'm going to ask one that's probably premature and maybe sort of comic effect. But the lines at Blaine, Washington to cross into Canada have already been pretty long. And just this month, personal possession of marijuana has become legal. Any idea what that's going to do?
David?
Well, I'm the wrong guy to ask about errors of omission and commission, but there are in BC, I even though it's probably still criminalized, I don't think under Canadian statute, I don't think you'd see the difference. But in all sincerity, I think we have to, and I actually wanted to swing, if I could use this opportunity to swing back to the previous question, I think harmonization of the game rules on both sides. And I think we have to, the one area where both technology and infrastructure could help us tremendously is looking further into customs pre-clearance. So that, we have a very successful project with passenger rail in BC, where previously the only modes of customs pre-clearance were air. Now, both your government and ours gets very worried about customs pre-clearance because it sounds costly. But I think through technology, there are ways to make that less costly and to start to stimulate some of that travel with other modes like passenger rail and bus, so that you can actually, again, have that information in advance. I know on the Eastern Corridor, the U.S. is doing some really interesting stuff with higher speed rail. That should connect all the way up to Montreal, but unless we can figure out a way to do customs pre-clearance there, we're going to hit literally a wall. We have different statutes and we have different laws. The most interesting progress will mean nothing to this crowd, but our big win this year was called the Reasonable Accessibility Policy. Only in Ottawa could you make up a tag called the Reasonable Accessibility Policy. But in a sense, after 9/11, and trying to be more Catholic than the Pope and try to out-security the U.S. so that we were considered good trading partners, we put up a whole bunch of self-imposed barriers. One was those with fairly minor criminal offenses were being rejected at the Canadian border. So if you were, and I'm not using this as this is a real case. You're a CEO. You're going to a conference in Toronto. You're going to make a keynote address, and you had a DUI in college 25 years ago. You were just kicked out. You were not admitted to Canada. So we've made provisions, again, different criminal codes, different legal systems. We've made provisions now so that you effectively get a one-time pass and warning to reapply for a special exemption, but you're not going to be rendered inadmissible to Canada. So I think when you get to some of those cross-border legal issues, I think there are ways to accommodate them.
And that raises another dimension which we haven't had time to talk about, which is with all this data flowing back and forth, the issues of privacy, which are very important with the technology to have the controls there. And that is a perfect entree to a plug. Those of you who are followers of the Wilson Center will know this, but one of the previous One Issue, Two Voices series, Mary Ellen Callahan and Wesley Wark wrote on privacy and information sharing, and they called it the search for an intelligent border, like the search for intelligent life. We're trying to make the border smart. If it's not intelligent, maybe education will do us no good. But these are now available in bulk outside, so if you didn't grab one on the way in, or if they were running out, they've been restocked. Also, you can grab a copy of the piece that Laura and I did, which is a perfect segue to the next panel. So thanks to my panel. Thanks very much. There's no break, right? All right, no break. Don't go anywhere. No flipping.
I'm not staying. I'm just moving.
Who will I be this time, Kendra? Okay.
You can be anything you want to be.
I brought my own water. Oh. What a great audience. Look at that. They just stay and stay. They are the Energizer bunnies of Public Policy Forum.
I go first, but I don't want to.
I'm going to just go in the order of the paper.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Paul Fraser. Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to be moderator of this final session of today's discussion. We've been privileged throughout the morning to have a terrific and such a well-informed and insightful group of speakers. And I hesitate to raise expectations, but I feel confident that our two speakers in this final session will more than meet what we've all come to hear and discuss further. Or by way of beginning this discussion, I should declare a bias. I grew up in Niagara Falls, Ontario. The border is in my genes. My parents owned and ran a modest tourism establishment for many, many years. My introduction to the world was through that experience, not only to the wide range of wonderful people who came from the United States to visit Niagara, but those who came from places even further away via the United States or directly into Canada to visit Niagara. When I worked in government and worked with ministers at the federal level, I was often nudging them to spend time at the border. This was certainly long before 9/11. Get to the border, see the border, have a sense of what you encounter at the border. I had the privilege as a university student to help pay my university fees by working at the Rainbow Bridge as a customs and immigration officer. And I assure you that I would recommend it to each and every one of you. 1 8-hour shift will open your eyes to a very different and quite diverse world of both individuals and things that cross the border constantly. 9/11, of course, we've all acknowledged what that impact has been. But as we go forward and into this discussion, I would I'd like to raise a few points, and let's see how they're addressed in the presentations. And if not, perhaps some of you will wish to pursue them in discussion afterwards. There's been a mention of engaging the political side more effectively, whether it's the Congress or whether it's politicians in Canada. I think the majority would say, well, we really have to engage the Congress more aggressively, more effectively. My comment there would be careful what you suggest, be careful what you ask for, so we can pursue that. the Beyond the Border and the RCC leave out a number of things. That's been touched upon this morning, and again, we'll hope that they're addressed somewhat in this discussion, whether it's the issue of labor mobility, whether it's the issue perhaps of services, whether it's the issue of energy. I think we also have to wonder more about the possible impact of ongoing budget restraint in this country in particular, but also in Canada, where we have a tighter financial situation. Will this lead to more creative thinking within and among agencies and departments of government on both sides of the border that will allow and encourage, certainly, a better approach, a more imaginative approach to the reallocation, not just of financial resources, human resources, as well as the adoption of certain technology. In sum, I'd like to think that we can look at the whole exercise of Beyond the Border and the RCC as a huge confidence-building exercise. It's daunting. It's a reference we made with respect to the post-Soviet Russians in 1990, that we had to stick with them because this was all an effort of confidence building. Well, I think we forget that. Two things we forget in North America is that we're each engaged still in nation building, and that we are also, in a bilateral sense, still engaged in confidence building. 9/11 brought that home in spades, I think, but it's something we shouldn't, I suggest, lose sight of. And then I think we can look for comments where we see hope, that despite the frustrations, the setbacks, the ongoing impediments, that progress in these efforts will lead to the establishment of mechanisms for the long term, will bring greater clarity and certainty to the overall process and approach. And as long as we can maintain public support for political action and ongoing goodwill in this respect, then I think we have started something, the end of which we aren't certainly fully certain of yet. But I, again, am confident that what I've read to date and what I've heard this morning does give me some renewed confidence. And with that, I would like to call upon Christopher Sands to make his first remarks, followed by Laura Dawson.
Okay, well, I don't want to hinder any of that sort of hope, but I want to talk about being pragmatic about our hopes for BTB and RCC. And because we've been talking about some of these things before, because we're likely to be talking about them for a long time, when the next president gets elected and the next president and, you know, the next Canadian government, et cetera, I think we need to think about process. And we've had some time to think about what works. And I want to highlight what I think are 6 keys to making things like this work, making these processes work, and maybe future processes. 6 key things. The first, and you've heard bits of that from speakers already, is how the process handles inclusivity, how it brings people in. One of the things we learned from SPP that we didn't have at the NAFTA working group level was real business input in terms of identifying the regulations that are not only, well, we don't want to say low-hanging fruit anymore, but are nonetheless really important and make a big difference to business. Having business there to support agreements, just like we wanted them to support NAFTA and so on, bringing the business community in is important. But let's be honest, with SPP, the business community volunteered themselves. They got organized, they came forward, and one of the SPP challenges was that civil society, a great many people who are concerned about regulation, but maybe not from the same perspective of business, whether they're environmentalists or consumer health advocates or just consumer advocates, were on the outside. And so during the SPP, we had a lot of people saying, hey, you know, how come we're not invited to the table? Why aren't we participating? Now, governments have worked hard to try to open up the process, but darn, business is pretty good. They've got themselves organized. And we heard earlier about the Chamber of Commerce putting together a stakeholder consultation group, which is a great effort. But we have a lot of civil society that has a stake in how we do regulatory cooperation, even border cooperation, that isn't engaged. And we need to think about how to get them involved, even if we have to give them an engraved invitation. Also, I think that one of the groups that is very important to include that we haven't seen here yet are the states and provinces, particularly on the regulatory side. We learned this at the border. It was one thing to change some of the border infrastructure, but the roads leading up to the border were state and provincial roads, and we needed other people involved. For emergency management, we needed to get states and provinces involved. On the regulatory side, that's important too, and we don't have exactly aligned regulatory competences between the federal governments and their sub-national or sub-federal constituents in both countries, these crazy constitutions we adopted. So we need to think about how we get them involved early, especially in the pilot project stage. And I think inclusivity, the more people you bring in, I know it makes things more complicated and slow, but the better you build for the thing to have durability and legitimacy in the eyes of the great majority of our Canadian and American friends who are not engaged in this every day, who are more likely to say no if it's complicated and it's presented to them as a surprise down the road. We want to keep the public support of this process, and the key is to have all of these agencies included, all these groups included. So inclusivity. Second thing that I think is important is how we handle exclusivity. And Paul Fraser mentioned this. We've heard it earlier today. I think this is particularly the issue of Congress. When we began this process, there was a conscious effort to keep Congress on the side. And the reason was that, first, the governments, particularly the United States government, felt that we had statutory authority to make changes without going back to Congress. The NAFTA treaty ratification was painful here, much like the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement was painful in Canada. Congress is difficult. I sometimes think of the president and the prime minister in the context of being the firemen of the relationship. You know, they rush in to help when we have something going on. And Congress is sort of the gang of arsonists of the relationship, always setting things aflame and causing us problems. And yet, as you've heard here, we need to make regulatory changes. We're going to need to have money to pay for things that isn't there, and there's no way around Congress. When you get into some of the regulatory and border issues that don't make sense, why do we have a border crossing here rather than there? Why is this particular piece of technology located in this place and not another place? Why is regulation of a product, as Kelly Johnson was saying in the case of food, somehow partly in agriculture and partly in the FDA? The answer is usually a congressional committee of jurisdiction that wants to have oversight, and they want to have a role in this so they can tell their voters, hey, I'm really important to what you do every day. So not including them is the easier path, but ultimately I think we have to include them in some way. And we've heard some good ideas here, but exclusivity, excluding them, has been a problem, and figuring out how to resolve that is very important going forward. Third challenge, reciprocity. I think there's a dynamic that sometimes goes on, if you think of it as sort of a two-level game, where here in the United States you have regulators who are dealing with issues, and you have border security people dealing with issues with competing demands. Not just Canada, and we like the Canadians, but the Mexicans, the TPP partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Europeans who we heard about from Michael Fitzpatrick. They also have domestic considerations. There we talk about regulatory capture as big lobbies get really well comfortably in with particular agencies. Some of our regulatory and border problems are on purpose. People benefit from them. There's a reason there's a barrier. People make a lot of money on that barrier. They may get to have an extra plant on one side of the border, or maybe their particular product gets a leg up on foreign competition because of it. Tariffs used to be that way, and we used to think, oh, tariffs, they're just raising revenue for the government. And once we got wise to the fact that people were using tariffs to protect themselves and make a lot of money, we realized, okay, we got to get rid of these things. It's the same with a lot of the regulation. And to pretend naively that the regulation is all in the public interest and we just have to sort out the public interest side, ignoring the fact that there are a lot of people gaming the system, I think is foolish. What I mean by reciprocity is this. I think that Canada wants this more than the Americans do. And I think you get into a dynamic where the Canadians come and say, we could adopt your procedures. In fact, we could offer you some data that might help advance passenger information, And the American officials say, oh, thank you very much, Canada. We'll take that gift. And then they go into their internal battles with other agencies, with other people, and say, hey, I should have the lead on this particular issue because I've got this Canadian data. I've got this relationship that gives me a leg up. Oh, okay, great. You just made somebody a winner in the United States. Oh, but then Canadians turn around and say, hey, since I was kind of helpful to you, do you think you could help me with a little concession? Oh, gosh, no. Do you know if I give up something, then I'm losing in my internal turf battles within the U.S. government. I might have Congress say I don't need the budget next year for this because I gave it up. That dynamic, I think, works in favor of continued Canadian concessions you're already building us a bridge, thank you very much, but where we keep shaking the Canadians down to conform not to a new standard of regulation and border management, but to the Americanization of the Canada-U.S. space, where everything has to be the American way because it's the only way we're going to get moved forward. I believe this was epitomized in the Wizard of Oz with this sort of wicked witch just saying "Surrender, Dorothy." But if that's the basis for this cooperation with Canada, it's not going to be durable or legitimate in the eyes of Canadians. And just as legitimacy in the eyes of Americans matters, I think it also matters in the eyes of Canadians. And we're going to have a process that works for both sides and doesn't just tilt in favor of the American playing field. Fourth, I think we need to think about replicability. We are doing pilot projects. We're discovering best practices. That's great, but we've got to take those best practices first across the border, and that's a cost thing. We've got to not just discover good ideas, but spread them. But secondly, we need to think globally. That's the way the Americans think about these things. When we did the Container Security Initiative in early 2002, between the United States and Canada, putting U.S. and Canadian customs officers working together in New York, New Jersey, Long Beach, Seattle, Tacoma, Vancouver, Montreal, and Halifax. It worked. It was a great idea. It was a smart program for inspecting shipping containers. And then what did the Americans want to do? Do the same thing in Rotterdam, do the same thing in Singapore, because it was a good idea, and we tested the model with the Canadians. And I think it's very important that as we move forward, we think about developing best practices and moving very quickly to implementing them on as big a scale as possible. Canada is our best and most trusted partner. That's where it starts, but that isn't where it stops. And Laura will talk about this a little bit, I know, but I think sometimes there is pressure in the Canada-U.S. space to say, well, this is a worthwhile Canadian initiative. We can make exceptions because it's only Canada after all. I feel like I just won on The Price is Right. But in fact, if it's just for Canada, this is not going to get very far. Congress won't fund it. We won't really make progress. This is for the world. This is for the governance of cross-border transactions on which our livelihood increasingly relies. So we have to think big and expect the migration of some of these ideas to go global. Fifth, portability. And this is where I think we need to address the fact that the United States is competing on multiple initiatives. A great friend of mine once wrote a book about about U.S.-Mexico relations, and he called it a marriage of convenience. Because, well, maybe it wasn't a marriage for love, but we're next to each other, so we have a marriage of convenience with Mexico. And I was at a session where he was talking about the book, and the response from one of the Mexicans in the audience is, yes, it's a marriage of convenience, but you Americans sleep around. And it's kind of true that we are no sooner talking about this with the Canadians than we're talking about with the Mexicans, with the TPP partners in Asia, and also with our partners in Europe. The U.S. is playing all of these negotiations off against each other. And you heard a bit of this from Michael Fitzpatrick on the first panel. Sure, we've got this RCC, which is going great with Canada, which we're holding up to the Europeans as possibly a model. But if the Europeans go for a big bang, then suddenly they'll be the model, and we'll come back to the Canadians and say, how about this? We need to think globally about all of these things and how what works between Canada and the U.S. isn't just idiosyncratic and Canadian, but can migrate, and we can move beyond to try to set global standards. And I think you see that in nanotechnology and other areas of BTB and RCC, where the U.S. and Canada have the potential to set a global standard and bring others to our way of thinking. And I think that's very important. Lastly, and I think this is maybe the most nakedly political component, I think we need to concern ourselves with expediency. The clock is always ticking. There are always other initiatives. There are always new reforms. When we wrote this paper, we didn't know the outcome of the U.S. election, and now we do. And I think the important thing here is that we come out of the gate in the second Obama term with some momentum. And that momentum is partly, I think as somebody was saying, a myth. It's partly in our minds. We all care about this stuff, but when the president is inaugurated, he's got new people in, as David Goldstein was saying. We have new people in, and there's a new sense. Is this a winner? Is this something you want to be associated with as a new official? The president is running about 50 feet ahead of the lame duck cloud, which is haunting him. And people will start saying, Obama was so yesterday. We're all excited about the new elections come the midterms. And the midterms we have elections all the time here. The midterms are in 2 years. Then we're going to be having presidential primaries again. Can you believe it? We're back on. So how do we get real momentum and real progress? And we don't know what the progress report says. We're going to find out in a day or so. But I'm almost willing to say now, whatever it is, we've got to applaud. This is like kindergartners at the school play. Okay, so they're not everything you'd hope. They're not going to win the Oscar this time. And yeah, they're out of tune and the costumes are terrible, but you know, they're just starting out. They need our applause so they get up on stage next year and eventually win the Oscar, or you know, we can all become the dance moms and really pleased that they are doing great and we can live off their earnings, you know, forever, which would be great. So what we need to do is encourage. And I know that sounds blind, but we've got to give this government a boost. We've got to give people in the trenches a sense that being associated with this has been good for their careers, that it's appreciated out there, even if it's baby steps. I thought it was my last thought. I thought it was very interesting the way in which the last panel talked about holding us accountable. You know, that's the problem with being in DHS or any of the regulatory agencies in the U.S., and I assume Canada as well. You're accountable to the legislature, to the government. All you deal with is accountability. Someone is always yelling at you. And if something goes wrong, a terrorist gets through, you know, bad can of Campbell soup, not that there is such a thing, somehow sneaks through, then somebody's fired. Not only that, somebody has to live with the idea that there was somebody hurt because this overworked, under-resourced, frazzled person in government might have missed something. And we all miss something. That's the world in which they live, very high pressure. And what they're saying to us is we respond to accountability. So you in the business community and the civil society hold us accountable. And yeah, we should hold them accountable. They respond to accountability. But we also have to give them some praise and encouragement. And I think this is the time to do it, to be expedient about it, because in 4 years' time, we're going to be sitting around a table like this saying, now what? Is it BTB2? Or are we going to come up with another crazy name and acronym and start the process again? Because we have to talk about this stuff. It's that crucial. With that, let me turn it back over to Laura.
Thank you, Chris.
Or
Thank you. And let me just say as well, it's great to have Paul as the chair, because he really is Canada's gut check in Washington. He's our reality check, having lived and worked here for many years, but still having the Canadian sensibilities and still saying process instead of process. He's seen these initiatives come and go. And is able to help all of us out figure out what's for real and what's political packaging or another trend. I hope he thinks that this is for real. When I wrote this paper, I wasn't sure that it was for real. And so I used the Charlie Brown analogy of Lucy with the football and saying, yeah, come on, take the kick. This time, Charlie Brown, it's going to be for real. Because this is a little bit like the Canada-U.S. relationship. Canada is not only desperate for U.S. attention, but it is essential for our economy. It's essential for our well-being. I know you've heard this statistic many, many times, or this saying that 90% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of a U.S. shopping center, but it's true. And we pay very close attention to what's going on. And so since writing this paper and then working with a lot of clients who are interested in this issue, I am so very impressed by the seriousness of intent and the real sea change in the way that we cooperate and the way that we consult. I think that this time it is for real. But there are something like 500 statutory instruments that are administered at the Canada-U.S. border. I think Canada's got about 100, the U.S. has about 400. And I noticed that there's folks in uniform at the back of the room. I suspect some of them maybe have something to do with administering these statutory instruments. And it's just not that easy. It's the spirit is willing. We've got the high level, we've got the stakeholders, we've got the mid-level, but it's so darned complicated. It's like a bathroom renovation. Have you ever, the handle's fallen off the tap in your bathroom, you say, oh, got to replace the faucet, and then you have to replace the vanity, and then you have to replace the wall, and then you have to replace the toilet, and then you spent $50,000 renovating your upstairs.
This is getting personal.
Everybody's done that or been in that situation. That's what this is like. So here's a good example of how well we're doing is I've been working off and on an issue related to Tier 4 emission standards for engines, the flex engine file. And when I first started talking to Canadian and American regulators about this, I said, we have agreed on the outcome for our emission standards. We're fine. It's fine. And then we go back to the industry, and the industry says, well, yes, they've agreed on the end point, but Canada and the U.S. have two totally different approaches for the staging, the phase-in of these higher and higher requirements. So us as manufacturers, we're never sure whether we should meet the higher standard on the U.S. side or meet the lower standard on the Canadian side. We're always going to be out of compliance. We're always going to be manufacturing something more expensive for a least expensive market. We need people to cooperate. At that point, talking to these regulators, they said, yeah, well, we've agreed on the end point, but we can't get a meeting with the other side. The last time we met with them was 18 months ago, for real. So now they've moved ahead. They are moving. They are talking. It doesn't take 18 months to get a meeting, but I was talking to somebody the other day about flex engines. I thought, things are pretty much solved. And I said, well, no, because the Canadians still measure the stuff going into the engine. The Americans still measure the stuff going out of the engine. It's still inspected by two different regulators, and it costs me $15,000 to send my engine to Ottawa. So it's better, but it's not best, and it's because of the level of detail. And we have the best intentions, but especially when we get into the legal aspects on the border, when we get into things that I've learned about called privileges and immunities, what the various officials are allowed to do at the borders, and differences between Canadians and Americans, the treatment of personal information, whether or not you can fingerprint someone that you suspect might be a bad guy but that you turn away from the border. How deep is that border? Can you pursue someone 5 miles from the post, 10 miles from the post, 50 miles from the post? This stuff is difficult. I believe that the regulators, the officials, are going at this with the most seriousness of intent, but this is the bathroom renovation from hell. And it's not that Canadians and Americans mostly are not inclined to cooperate and do the right thing, but there are what they call the RBGs, the really bad guys, who are within our borders and outside our borders, who are looking for opportunities to exploit our weaknesses. I don't know if some of you followed the story of the Roma folks the other day who came into Mexico, snuck across the U.S. border, transshipped themselves to the Canadian border, ran the border post there, headed to the McDonald's or the Tim Hortons in somewhere in Quebec, and claimed refugee status. Well, this is a problem on all sorts of levels. It's a regulatory problem. It's a legal problem. It's a problem of two systems that haven't quite meshed up. Despite our best intentions, we have to make sure that the system works not only for the law-abiding folks and the moms and pops going through the border, but also to make sure that we can filter out the RBGs. So I mocked slightly this morning the chrysanthemum rust story. And the meat cut nomenclature and the other things that we're doing in RCC, and also BTB. But I want to emphasize the importance of these pilot programs. These are not just delivering outcomes for the unmanned aircraft industry, for the chrysanthemum industry. These are delivering new ways of doing things that we didn't have in the past. The inspected once, cleared twice, the authorizing Canadian officials to test for American standards, the submission of data at the very same time. This is actually the rocket science of what we do, and we're making very strong progress with it. We, instead of 18 months for our regulators and our officials to meet, we are now in the habit of cooperation. With the White House executive order and a similar cabinet directive from the Treasury Board of Canada, we have an obligation to cooperate. So we need to take this habit and this obligation and institutionalize this cooperation into the longer term. Chris has mentioned some of the challenges. We talked about sustainability earlier on. I would advocate that we need to go public, much more public on these issues. We've been flying under the radar so far because we know that when you take the N-word, NAFTA, out into public and you start talking about cooperation with Canada on standards, technical barriers, consumer standards, safety, etc., there will be pockets of the population that will freak out. But as long as we stay under the radar, we can't move ahead and institutionalize the cooperation that we need. This cannot be long-term unless we are all very used to it, unless we come out of the shadows. One of the things that I would like to see, as was mentioned, is that we package up this model for Trans-Pacific Partnership, for our work in European Union, for our work in Asia. I mean, Chris, I may be putting words in his mouth, but he's a bit cynical. I think he thinks, you know, the U.S. is going to export this good stuff to everyone else, and Canada is going to be left standing in the shadows. My intention is that Canada should be tethered to the U.S. in these various initiatives, and we are trading partners together. We are negotiating partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I would like to see the Canada-U.S. RCC model as the Trans-Pacific Partnership model because, again, that institutionalizes what we do. And I think the most important thing, and I'm looking at Ed Walking here. Hi, Ed. Hi. Regional. The guy from Detroit, Great Lakes Chamber of Commerce, etc. That's where the key to our success lies. Getting attention for northern border issues in Washington is very, very difficult. But if you have 8 states and 2 provinces saying, yes, we want this, we think this is important, if you have organizations like EDS, if you've got the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, if they're leaning on their local level decision makers, and they're the ones that are seeing progress, they're seeing evidence of economic success as a result of a better border. That's the political leverage I think we need to make this a sustainable long-term initiative. Thank you for your patience and your cooperation this morning. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Chris, very, very much. We now have a few minutes for comments, questions, and answers. One quick comment I might make. If I recall correctly, Penware is being used to kind of oversee a certain element of implementation. And based on our colleagues' comments this morning about regional or subnational entities, maybe we should take a closer look at what other opportunities there are on a regional basis. And the Great Lakes area, and certainly the Chicago regional area, might be an area to take a peek at. Those of you who are in research and can pursue that more closely, we'd welcome your views later on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Could we have a first question, please, or comment? I know the remarks were fairly complete and fulsome, but...
And remember what I said about lots of praise. I mean, if you just want to say we're great, that's also nice, you know.
There's no question. Yes, please.
Teresa.
Teresa.
I dive into the breach. Chris, you talked about engaging civil society groups in the process. And I would ask, one of the struggles government has generally is how to broaden its outreach without stretching itself too thin. As you said, government officials are very, very busy and very, very harried and don't have a lot of time. And so it's very easy to kind of go out to existing organizations and groups and say, okay, we've done our outreach. Civil society is amorphous. And it's very difficult to try to engage in a productive way. I think, for example, the White House Petition Initiative. There are probably some nuggets of really great stuff in there, along with a lot of really strange stuff, too. And somebody's got to spend the time to sift through all of that. But that was an effort at really trying to engage the broader society and what the administration wants to do. So I would ask, what are your suggestions? First of all, what parts of civil society you think have not been touched yet, have not been engaged and should be? And how do you suggest the governments go about doing that?
All right, it's a very good question. I think there are a couple of levels of this. First, and I have to give credit to BTB and RCC. One of the lessons we learned from SPP, all these acronyms, is to have more information up on the web. And we used to have this site called spp.gov, and you could go and get some information there. But one of the things that I think the governments are doing better, but could do even better, is putting up more things on the web. The notion that we're going to have this action, we have an action agenda, we're going to have an update report, which is coming out, that's really valuable. The reason for that is that when people don't know what's going on and they start, the governments are up to something, they'll try to define it in the public mind by saying, oh, they must be up to this. And I think the sooner that people can say, no, I just Googled it and I found out the governments are actually doing this, that's helpful. So at the most basic mass communications level, I think that's useful, but it needs to be, as accessible as possible, a little more. Sometimes I think some of the descriptions of things aren't, unless you really know the arcana of regulation, all that clear. So maybe there's a way to make it even that much simpler. So that's one thing. Second, I think we ought to be engaging the public through their representatives. That's one of the reasons I think Congress is really important. It's one of the reasons I think states important. The states are important because I think a lot of people really don't deal with the minutiae of government and governance, but they trust that they hired somebody to do that for them who will raise the alarm if something's gone wrong. And I think engaging them is a second level of protection. But then when it comes to civil society itself, the two, maybe three obvious groups who are probably the easiest to engage, although, as you say, they're amorphous, are the environmental community, because some of what we're doing across the border is related to energy. The environmental community is going to be worried about local impacts of border infrastructure as well, trying to engage them, partly because they're organized and at least you can talk to their leadership. That's an important element. A second element, and this is, you'll see that I'm just going from some of the NAFTA constituencies, would be labor. I think we think of labor as sort of wary of trade barrier reduction and so on. We have this sort of impression, but actually, I think we haven't engaged labor enough on how some of this regulation makes their lives difficult. They're the ones who are actually the truck drivers putting things in trucks and trying to figure out, how do I get my break periods in while I'm trying to meet all these requirements. I think organized labor could help us find ways to streamline processes and be a partner in this to an extent that they have not been. And I think from this administration, perhaps less the George W. Bush one, but this one, I think there would be a welcome response if there's a way to engage organized labor. And the third group, which I think is the one that I worry about a little bit because they're so quiet at the moment, is the legal community that worries about privacy and individual rights. The American way of litigation by regulation by litigation is really important. It's not so Canadian. Canadians are slightly more civilized, but our approach is not to think that the government can regulate everything, but to expect the government to do its best and then sue them when they don't, or sue them when they breach protocol, or of all the rules they have to enforce, they don't get the priority right and somebody's been hurt. And so whether it's a privacy issue for data sharing, or whether it's an individual who gets hassled on the border because they're on a terror watch list, or it's because somebody got tainted Mexican strawberries or something, there's this legal community impact that's going to come. And I think to find a way to engage people who are privacy advocates, civil rights advocates, consumer advocates, and bring them into a discussion about how this could work for them. Because we aren't racing to the bottom. We're trying to create a high standards community here where they understand that they'll have a certain amount of rights. What happens when it's a Canadian regulatory failure that has somehow caused a problem? How do we deal with that in the litigation system? And I think that would be an important community to approach as well. So that's a very complicated menu, and I know it's a challenge for government, but I lay it out because I think it's an important part of this that we haven't got.
I think that I'll just go back to the point that I think we have been too much under the radar, and that we have done very poorly, I say this collectively, we, Canada, the United States, in a public outreach campaign. The public relations, public media communications has been very weak, and it's been obscured by technical jargon that most people don't understand. And so people are having a very hard time recognizing their own interests in the 25 RCC working areas, 30-some BTB working areas. It's important that we go back to these folks and say, look, what we've done for meat cut nomenclature, we can do for you. As Michael Fitzpatrick said this morning, GE doesn't even have anything on the board in the current iteration of RCC initiatives, but it's hopeful that what we do in this phase will help us out in the next phase. So the governments are now reaching out to business constituents and saying, what's of interest to you for phase 2? What do you want? The business communities I'm talking to are saying, I still don't see a strong benefit for us here. How does this actually work? Or they're saying, oh, the government wants to know what they can do to help me. Well, first, the taxes are too high and the roads are too bad and whatever it is. So they're not really keying into what these initiatives can do. So there's a lot of wheel spinning going on now.
And then I think a lot of the public that perceives this at all thinks this is an initiative to get governments to stop doing stupid things. Because they think the government's doing a lot of stupid things that they don't understand. So they think this is like a common sense thing. Like, go in and, I don't want to steal from Mike Harris, but a common sense revolution. Let's get government to kind of make sense. And I think that's why there are low expectations for it. And I think that's why there's no applause when they do. Because they think, oh, great, finally you're not doing that stupid thing anymore.
Well, but this whole thing could sink beneath the waters in the United States, and no one would really take pause. In Canada, if it sinks beneath the waters, there'll be a serious political problem for the government of Canada, because the government of Canada will have been seen to have gone out on a very important limb politically. And when we get back to confidence building, this will, in fact, could have some very negative impacts on the government. To the point of communications, it's also a government that does not communicate well generally. But that's the quandary. And I agree with a comment you made earlier, and yourself as well, Laura. We have to be very positive about what we get in the first set of outcomes and to help push it forward. And dealing with not only Congress here, I think more work has to be done with caucuses in Ottawa, whether it be in the government or in the opposition. I'm not sure that those folks fully understand and appreciate exactly what this is all about and what it can lead to. Do we have another, we have time for two last questions, one over here and one over here, please.
Do you want to read that, Bridget? No, I don't. It's too sad. Oh, we just had a news item on the current news. Commercial traffic heading into Canada via the Ambassador Bridge can expect delays Wednesday because of a work slowdown by customs officials upset over being required to wear name tags. A check of Canada Border Services Agency showed a wait time of 30 minutes. There are no recorded delays for passenger traffic. A number of officers at CBSA at the stands have refused to work over a recent mandate that they wear name tags.
Is that the
Eric?
With respect to this whole issue of reaching out, one of the things I want to put on the table is a bit of a factual counterpoint, and that is I would encourage you to all read the August 2011 summary report that was done of all of the materials received by the Government of Canada in its consultations. And if you look at the annex of that, you will see that we in the Beyond the Border team met with inter alia, the Assembly of First Nations, the Council of Canadians, the Centre for Policy Alternatives, the business community, the United Steelworkers community, the United Steelworkers Union, the Canadian Auto Workers Union, etc. So there has been a lot of consultation on that, to the point of sinking below the waves in the U.S. It is, I think, factually correct that there hasn't been the same level of intensive consultation in the U.S. But that process did take place in Canada. And when you're sitting down across the border or across the table with people who don't necessarily agree with you, it isn't always pleasant, but it's a democracy and you need to go and explain your position. And that indeed did take place in the process and is continuing to take place.
That's a great point. Can I respond to that? I mea culpa. The Government of Canada, the Government of the United States did a great job in the initial consultations and in consultations with specific sectors that would be affected. They continue to do that. I attend far too many consultations in downtown Ottawa. Where we're falling down is in the packaging of that information for mass consumption. You never hear the good border stories. You only hear the bad border stories. You only hear David saying, I hate my Nexus card. Me, I love my Nexus card. My Nexus card is the best thing ever. But we have become consumers of bad experiences, and we're not doing a good enough job saying, look, this is what's working. This is what we're trying to make better. We need your support to make this better.
And let me just say that I think that part of my long rambling set of concerns with the United States, the sink below the wave issue is an important one. To the extent that we think we're doing something nice for Canadians, I think it's always going to be seen as marginal. To the extent that we are, as Americans like to do, and we're in the process of ruling the world. We're trying to figure out how to create some global standards and do something really big. Then we talk about Canada in the context of, if we take Canada, who's really on the vanguard of this, and we treat them badly, we embarrass their government, we reward their being forthcoming with basically not much, and we let this thing die or stall, then no one is going to try to engage with this again. Now, we saw this on tariffs. In the early days of tariff reduction, there were a lot of fits and starts. We think about the attempt to create an international trade organization in Havana that didn't go well. There were lots of brief liberalizations followed by American protectionism. And what it told us was that, this isn't going to be easy, and it took a long time to get where we need to be. The United States, in good faith, has to show that we can make it work with Canada, and if we make it work with Canada, go global, and let the public know that this is about something that is bigger than just Canada and North America. It's about the way we do trade.
Yeah, I'd like to posit for everybody the notion that something bigger is really the supply chains.
Yep.
At the end of the day, this is about supply chains and supply chain performance, and that's how an economy competes in North America with the rest of the world. And when people start to think about it in terms of supply chains rather than this manufacturer or that manufacturer or this country or that country, I think it elevates the critical nature of this to a much higher level. And Mayor Francis from Windsor said it best. He said, we live in the middle of a vast supply chain, a vast assembly line, and the sooner we recognize how to do that and do that well, the more competitive we'll be and the more jobs we'll add.
Thank you.
Yeah, it delivers jobs.
Well, thank you. We've come up to noon. I did want to very quickly add my Nexus story. I was coming through in Montreal the other night, and I always wanted to see what they have on the screen there. And the guy looked at me and said, don't you have a Nexus card? You come through all the time. I was like, well, I do. I had it expired. It's a long story. It's taken a long time to get it done. I can go get my supervisor now. And I said, wow, I really appreciate this, but there's a 45-minute line behind me, not today. So I would remind you that the two publications we have, the one on privacy and the topic of today's a safe and smart border. I'd also like to bring your attention to the blog we have in the back. We really are trying to get all the information we can up there. There's info from the governments, there's contributions from any of you. If you have anything, internal documents, government documents, articles, whatever, help them up there. We're going to reorganize it so it's better to get, but there's a lot of information up there. Also, if you're involved in a working group and there's a publication there, I mean, we did talk about the lack of communications and the lack of getting the information out there, and some people just don't realize that other people want to read the information. I mean, Group 19 may not know what Group 26 is doing, and it's helpful for them to know what that's happening. Also, if you're interested in the Stakeholder Coordination Council that Adam mentioned earlier, see me afterwards, or we'll get you in touch with Adam Schlosser at the U.S. Chamber. It's a good group, and it's got its own life as well. So stay tuned. We'll be doing more of these reports on BTB and RCC, particularly when the documents come out and more analysis. We'd like to get some regulators in. So pay attention if you have ideas for how we can keep this process going and get some more information out there, more discussion. Please let us know. Again, thank you for participation. Thank you to the panels today, and have a great weekend.
Communications.